The morning sun was just starting to glint off the wings of Flight 427 as it taxied down runway 27R at Denver International Airport. The autumn air was crisp, almost biting, with a thin mist hovering above the tarmac. Captain Marcus Reynolds, a veteran with more than 20 years in the cockpit, checked his instruments with methodical precision. His co-pilot, Lena Ortiz, mirrored his movements, eyes sharp behind her visor. They had done this 1,000 times. Takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, landing, a routine etched into muscle memory. Among the passengers was a young teenager, Alex Harper, seated near the emergency exit. Alex had a quiet confidence that seemed out of place for a 16-year-old. While his peers were lost in phones and earbuds, Alex was buried in aviation manuals and flight simulator schematics. He had memorized engine diagrams, memorized control procedures, and spent countless nights imagining himself in the cockpit, feeling every jolt and adjustment as if it were real. It had been a secret obsession for years, one that his friends called weird, and his parents encouraged quietly, not knowing how far Alex's talent could go. The plane rumbled along the runway. Engines purred, vibrations under the feet steady and familiar. Reynolds checked his altimeter, glanced at Lena, and nodded. "All systems go," he said, voice calm but carrying the subtle tension of responsibility for hundreds of lives. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and with a roar the aircraft accelerated, lifting into the blue sky. Passengers cheered softly, unaware that a quiet storm of terror was about to break. 20 minutes into the flight, the cabin had settled. Flight attendants moved down the aisles offering coffee and breakfast. A businessman typed rapidly on his laptop. A mother tried to soothe her fussy toddler. Outside, the view was breathtaking. The Rockies stretched endlessly, capped with snow, the sun glinting on craggy peaks. But inside, a subtle vibration under the cabin floor began to grow, an almost imperceptible warning. Reynolds noticed first. He muttered, fingers brushing the yoke. Lena noticed the readouts flicker. Then, without warning, the first alarm blared. Red lights flashed on the console, shrill and insistent. Both pilots' hearts skipped. Reynolds' voice cut through the cabin calmly at first, then sharper. "Engine 1 fluctuating. Engine 2 fluctuating. Check systems." The co-pilot toggled switches, hit emergency reset buttons. Nothing. The hum of the engines turned to an unsettling whine, then a silence so heavy it seemed to press on the eardrums. The plane shook. Passengers screamed as the craft shuddered violently. Coffee cups tipped, laptops flew off trays, and a mother clutched her child to her chest as she screamed. Oxygen masks dropped with a mechanical clang. Reynolds gritted his teeth. "Both engines, they're dead," he muttered. Lena's face went pale. "How?" "Systems were green," she said, eyes wide with disbelief. At that moment, a quiet voice cut through the chaos from the rear of the cabin. It was hesitant but oddly firm. I know how to land this." All eyes turned to Alex. Teenagers weren't supposed to say things like that, but the panic around him seemed to sharpen his focus rather than dull it. Flight attendants froze, unsure if the boy was joking. The passengers' screams faltered as everyone turned toward the rear, searching for the source. Alex's calm defiance seemed out of place in the middle of absolute chaos. Reynolds' hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the yoke. Could this kid actually know what he was talking about? A part of him, a very small part, wanted to dismiss it. But the other part, the part trained to recognize unusual skill or intuition, hesitated. Both engines were dead. Hundreds of lives hung in the balance. And here was a 16-year-old claiming he could somehow bring them down safely. The intercom crackled as Reynolds, voice tight, finally responded. "Did you say you can land this plane?" Alex's voice remained steady. I've spent thousands of hours in simulators. I know procedures. I need to get in the cockpit." His words, though trembling at the edges, carried a confidence that made even Reynolds pause. Meanwhile, the plane continued to drop, the ground creeping closer than any safe distance at 40,000 feet. Oxygen masks dangled, and the cabin lights flickered as the electrical systems fought to stay online. Flight attendants rushed to calm panicking passengers, but there was little they could do. Some passengers were praying, some were screaming, others were silently frozen in disbelief. Reynolds' eyes scanned the horizon through the cockpit windshield. Clouds passed by like sheets of white fire as the plane lost altitude at a terrifying rate. Denver lay miles ahead, but at the current rate of descent, even that seemed unreachable. He glanced back at Alex, who was gripping the nearest seat for support, eyes sharp, brain calculating every vector in real time. The teen's lips moved under his breath, quietly reciting sequences, emergency procedures, glide calculations, enough to make a veteran pilot raise an eyebrow. Lena interrupted the tense silence. "Captain, are you seriously considering letting him in?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. "We don't have time to hesitate. Both engines are gone and we're losing altitude fast. If he's right, he may be our only chance." His eyes flicked back to Alex, whose gaze had not wavered. The entire cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Just as Reynolds reached to unlock the cockpit door, another jolt shook the plane violently, throwing cups from trays, sending laptops skittering across the floor. A mother screamed, holding her child tighter. The engines, dead moments ago, now let out a faint, tortured whine like a dying animal. Alex's voice cut through the alarm and panic again, firmer now. "We can make it. You just need to trust me. Guide me and I'll land this plane." Reynolds paused, sweat dripping down his temple. The fate of over 200 souls balanced on the edge of impossibility. Could he trust a teenager with zero real-world flight experience in an actual emergency? Or was it already too late to second-guess? The cabin lights flickered again. Sparks popped from a console overhead. Passengers screamed. And outside, the endless blue of the sky seemed to mock them with its serenity, while the ground rushed closer, impossibly far yet terrifyingly near. Reynolds inhaled sharply, hand on the yoke. "Open the cockpit door," he commanded. Alex nodded, eyes fierce, heart pounding. This was it, the moment his countless hours of practice would either save lives or end in tragedy. As the cockpit door swung open, a deafening warning bell sounded from the console. Both pilots turned to see that the emergency altitude alarm was flashing red. Time was running out. And in the middle of chaos, with the engines silent and the plane plunging toward the earth, Alex Harper whispered to himself, almost to calm his own fear. "I've trained for this. I can do this." The plane trembled violently, the ground rushing closer, and Reynolds realized that the impossible decision had already been made. The cockpit door swung open, creaking under the strain, and the cabin seemed to inhale collectively. The murmur of panic hushed as every pair of eyes in the fuselage fell on Alex Harper. The teenager's sneakers squeaked against the linoleum aisle as he stepped forward, backpack clutched tightly in one hand, textbooks spilling slightly. He was pale, sweat slicking his forehead, but his gaze was sharp and unwavering. Captain Reynolds froze. He had seen many things in 20 years of flying, but nothing prepared him for a 16-year-old mid-flight, volunteering to guide a crippled 737 with both engines dead. Co-pilot Lena Ortiz's eyes widened behind her visor, disbelief mirrored in her reflection on the cockpit instruments. "Are you serious?" she asked, voice tight with disbelief. Alex swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, I can do it. I know the procedures. I've studied them extensively. Simulators, manuals, even videos of emergency landings. Please just trust me." The cabin seemed to pause, the screaming momentarily forgotten as the gravity of his words sank in. Reynolds' hand hovered over the yoke. Hundreds of lives hung between hesitation and trust. Could a teenager, however talented, really manage this? And yet, what choice did they have? Both engines were dead, altitude was dropping fast, and the sky outside their windows was no longer a vast expanse but a looming threat. Reynolds' voice, low and cautious, cut through the tension. "Alex, if you can actually help, you need to come up here. You'll need to follow instructions exactly as I say." Alex nodded, cheeks flushing with adrenaline, and moved toward the cockpit. Flight attendants tried to maintain calm, ushering passengers back into their seats, but the fear was palpable. A woman clutched her child and whispered frantic prayers, her voice barely audible over the metallic whine of the engines. The plane shuddered again, as if protesting the very idea of survival. As Alex climbed into the cockpit, Reynolds studied him closely. "You understand this isn't a simulator," he said, voice firm. "One mistake, one miscalculation, and—" He didn't finish the sentence. The implication was terrifyingly clear. Lives would end in an instant. "I understand," Alex said, hands trembling only slightly. He gripped the edge of the co-pilot's seat. "I've memorized the checklist. I know emergency glide patterns, engine restart procedures, flap adjustments, everything." The plane shuddered violently again, throwing Reynolds against the controls. The altitude was dropping faster than anticipated. Lena's fingers flew over switches, attempting to stabilize what little they could. Sparks flew from a flickering console as the cabin lights dimmed. Outside, the Rockies stretched endlessly, the jagged peaks looking impossibly close. Reynolds' mind raced. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before they would have to make impossible decisions. "Okay, Alex," Reynolds said finally, "here, what we're going to do. We'll attempt a controlled glide. You'll guide me on adjustments. Every maneuver has to be precise. Understand?" Alex nodded, eyes scanning the instruments, brain calculating variables at lightning speed. "Yes, Captain, we'll need to aim for the northern strip. Direct approach. Wind speed 25 knots gusting flare at 200 feet. Then glide, keep the descent rate under 1,000 feet per minute." His voice, confident and precise, gave Reynolds a sliver of hope. The plane lurched again. Oxygen masks floated as the fuselage rattled, passengers screaming anew. A father gripped his son's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. Reynolds glanced at the altimeter, 35,000 feet. They were losing altitude faster than expected. Suddenly, a loud metallic thud reverberated through the cabin. Passengers shrieked, thrown forward in their seats. The plane had clipped something large. Reynolds' stomach knotted as he looked out the window. A cargo drone, malfunctioning and on an erratic path, had smashed into the left wing. Sparks erupted, trailing smoke across the fuselage. Reynolds' hands tightened on the yoke. "Brace for impact," he started, but Alex cut in, voice calm and commanding. "Bank left 15 degrees. Don't stall. We'll avoid a catastrophic roll, trust me." Reynolds hesitated. This was insane. A teenager telling a seasoned pilot how to avoid disaster midair. But he had no other choice. He obeyed, following Alex's instructions, hands shaking. The plane tilted precariously. The cabin groaned as the wing bent under stress, then stabilized just barely. Passengers screamed. Coffee cups flew, papers tumbled across the aisle, and children whimpered. Flight attendants gritted their teeth, holding onto rails for stability. Alex's voice was steady, almost eerie in its calmness, as he guided Reynolds through maneuvers that would terrify even the most experienced pilots. Then the unthinkable happened. Another alarm blared. The landing gear had jammed. The plane wouldn't be able to land conventionally. The realization hit Reynolds like a punch to the gut. "No landing gear," he muttered under his breath. Lena gasped beside him. "We're going to have to belly land," she whispered, voice trembling. Alex's eyes narrowed, mind racing. "We can do it. We'll glide, flare at the last second, and slide along the tarmac. It's risky, but it's our only option." The plane continued to lose altitude. Outside, the Rockies gave way to sprawling suburbs. Denver's skyline was now visible, lights glinting under the thin clouds. The ground was rushing toward them. Reynolds glanced at Alex, who was pale, lips pressed together in concentration, hands gripping the edge of the co-pilot's seat, brain calculating vectors faster than any computer. "Captain," Alex said quietly, "we're going to make it, but we need complete focus. No panic, every second counts." Reynolds nodded, heart hammering in his chest. "I'm trusting you, Alex. Don't make me regret it." The teen gave a faint nod, then turned to scan the horizon, eyes tracing every detail of altitude, wind speed, and trajectory. The plane shuddered violently again. Passengers screamed anew. Sparks popped from the console overhead and the cabin lights flickered ominously. Suddenly, a crack appeared across the cockpit windshield. A bird had struck at high velocity. Reynolds' eyes widened in disbelief. Another hazard, another obstacle, but Alex didn't flinch. His mind calculated angles, speeds, and distances in a fraction of a second. "We're still good," he murmured. "Keep the glide steady, we can handle this." Lena exhaled shakily, glancing at Reynolds. "Are you seriously letting this kid guide us through this?" Reynolds swallowed hard. There was no time for doubt. "Yes," he said, voice tight, "it's either him or death, and right now he's our only chance." The plane continued its precarious descent. Outside, the city lights grew larger, closer, terrifyingly close. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Every passenger, every crew member seemed to hold their breath collectively, praying against the impossible odds. Alex Harper, 16, sat in the co-pilot's chair, brain working faster than anyone could imagine. And in that moment, as the plane pitched and rattled through turbulence, one truth became terrifyingly clear. Hundreds of lives depended on the courage, precision, and knowledge of a single, unlikely hero. And just as the northern runway came into view, Reynolds noticed a sudden blip on the radar. A new threat, moving fast toward them, metallic and uncontrolled. Alex Harper slid into the co-pilot's seat, the small leather cushion squeaking under his weight. Every pair of eyes in the cabin seemed to follow him, terrified, incredulous, and desperate. Reynolds felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. A teenager. Both engines dead. Hundreds of lives in limbo. But the kid's steady gaze and unnerving confidence somehow inspired a fraction of hope. "Okay," Reynolds said, voice tight, "we're going to glide toward the northern runway. I'll follow your instructions exactly. No improvising unless I tell you. Understood?" Alex nodded, hands resting lightly on the yoke, though his mind raced with calculations. "Yes, airspeed 250 knots, glide slope 3 degrees, descent rate less than 1,000 feet per minute, flaps half, don't stall." The plane lurched violently, the fuselage trembling under turbulence and the stress of disabled engines. Reynolds gritted his teeth, keeping hands firm on the yoke. Lena toggled switches furiously, trying to stabilize electrical systems, all the while monitoring alarms that seemed relentless. Sparks flickered from the overhead console. A metallic clanging echoed from the left wing. The cargo drone impact had caused structural damage. Alex's eyes scanned the instruments, memorized patterns of airspeed, altitude, and glide slope flickering in his mind like a computer simulation he had spent years mastering. "Bank left, 15 degrees, correct now, hold." "Steady, steady," his voice, surprisingly calm amid the chaos, guided Reynolds' hands. Passengers screamed, gripping armrests and each other, but a few noticed the remarkable serenity Alex exuded. Even the flight attendants, faces pale with terror, recognized the focused determination in his eyes. "He's calm," whispered one, clutching a mother and her toddler. "Almost unreal." The plane shuddered violently again, dropping several hundred feet in an instant. Reynolds muttered a string of expletives under his breath, glancing at Alex. The teen didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned closer, whispering calculations. "Adjust flaps 10 degrees, glide slope 5, we can compensate for the left-wing drag." Reynolds swallowed hard and obeyed, hands moving in precise tandem with Alex's instructions. The plane leveled slightly, a small victory amid mounting chaos. Lena exhaled shakily beside him, glancing at the teen. "If he's right, we might just make it," she muttered. Outside the cockpit, clouds rushed past like churning white waves. The Rockies, once a distant backdrop, were now mere miles below, their jagged peaks rising like a warning. Denver's skyline shimmered faintly in the haze ahead. The runway was coming into view, still far, still unreachable if everything went wrong. Suddenly, a loud thud reverberated through the fuselage. The wings scraped against another rogue object, another drone, a small private aircraft, or debris from above. Sparks erupted, and a panel in the cabin ripped loose, raining metal fragments. Passengers screamed anew, clutching each other. Reynolds' heart hammered. "Brace for turbulence," he shouted. Alex's eyes narrowed, brain racing. "Hold steady, we can glide past it. Don't overcorrect, we'll lose lift." His hands hovered near the controls, ready to guide Reynolds' fingers at the critical moment. Sweat ran down his temple, but his focus never wavered. Then the warning everyone feared: the landing gear was still jammed. Reynolds' stomach sank. "Belly landing, that's our only shot," he said grimly. Lena gasped beside him. "Do you realize what that means?" Alex's jaw tightened. "I know. We'll flare at the last moment, slide along the tarmac. We can control the descent if we manage airspeed and angle precisely." The cockpit instruments flickered. Electrical systems were failing intermittently. Reynolds gritted his teeth, glancing at Alex. "Are you sure you can do this?" Alex swallowed hard, eyes scanning instruments and outside terrain simultaneously. "I've done emergency glide landings in simulators, hundreds of scenarios. We can do it, but we have to act now. Every second counts." The plane pitched again, violently this time. Passengers' screams echoed through the cabin. A woman clutched her child, muttering prayers. A man wept openly, gripping a laptop like a lifeline. Reynolds tightened his grip on the yoke. Outside, the city lights were coming into sharper focus. The northern runway was visible, illuminated, beckoning, yet distant. "Steady, steady, adjust 3 degrees starboard," Alex instructed calmly, despite the chaos. Reynolds obeyed, muscles burning with tension. The fuselage groaned under the strain of compromised wings. Sparks popped from the console overhead. A sudden crack startled everyone. The cockpit windshield had a spiderweb of fractures. A bird had collided at high speed, adding another near-impossible variable. Reynolds froze for a fraction of a second, then glanced at Alex. The teen's fingers were poised, calculating, mind racing faster than anyone in the cockpit could follow. "Still good, we can maintain control. Glide slope adjusted," Alex said quietly. Reynolds exhaled shakily, nodding. Then the radio crackled to life, slicing through tension. "Flight 427, you are entering restricted airspace, unauthorized approach." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "We have an emergency," he shouted, voice tense. "Both engines out, full glide emergency. We have no other option." Outside, a radar blip appeared, an incoming aircraft intersecting their descent path. Reynolds' heart skipped a beat. Another collision could be fatal. But Alex, calculating instantly, barked instructions. "Bank left 30 degrees, descend rate controlled, maintain altitude buffer now." The plane tilted violently, passengers screaming. Objects tumbled from trays, children cried, and the cabin rattled with metal groaning under stress. Reynolds followed Alex's precise instructions, hands shaking, eyes scanning both instruments and the teen's face. The plane avoided the other aircraft by mere hundreds of feet, a near miss that sent adrenaline surging through everyone. For a brief moment, silence fell in the cockpit. Outside, Denver's lights were clearer now, the runway drawing near. Inside, Alex's lips moved rapidly, whispering calculations and angles under his breath. The plane was still descending, still alive, yet every second counted. Sparks flickered from consoles, oxygen masks floated overhead. Passengers held on to anything solid, eyes wide with terror. Reynolds glanced at Alex, face pale, drenched in sweat, but eyes blazing with determination. "We're going to try a belly landing," Reynolds said finally. "I'll follow your lead. You tell me everything." Alex nodded, biting his lip, scanning runway lights. "Flare at 200 feet, maintain glide slope, prepare for contact, then control slide with rudder and spoilers." The plane trembled violently as it descended below 5,000 feet. Passengers braced, prayers whispered, tears running down terrified faces. Outside, the runway lights grew larger, beckoning but threatening. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the plane could break apart on impact. The cockpit was a tense storm of fear, focus, and adrenaline. Reynolds' hands were locked on the yoke, Lena's fingers flying over switches, and Alex's mind orchestrating a descent that could only be described as impossible. Suddenly the fuselage jolted again, something scraped against the left wing. Sparks, metal groaning, and a brief spray of smoke. Reynolds' stomach sank, but Alex's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Hold steady, adjust flaps, glide slope, flare, we can make it." The plane tilted slightly, stabilized for now, and the northern runway was almost in sight. The impossible seemed achievable. But a warning bell from the instruments blared, a final reminder. The landing gear was still jammed, systems were failing, and the runway, though visible, was still hundreds of feet below them. Alex's eyes, blazing with concentration, scanned everything at once: altitude, glide slope, wind, runway length. He exhaled slowly and whispered to himself, almost inaudible, "This is it, we either survive or we don't." The northern runway stretched below like a ribbon of hope, lights glimmering through a thin veil of storm clouds. But hope was fragile, more like a shard of glass than a lifeline. The plane shuddered violently, groaning as if the fuselage itself understood the impossibility of what it faced. Sparks flickered from the console above, sending a metallic shower across the cockpit. Reynolds' knuckles whitened as he held the yoke. Lena's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Alex Harper's eyes were sharp, scanning instruments and terrain simultaneously. Sweat ran down his forehead, but his hands hovered over the controls with uncanny steadiness. "We need to avoid obstacles on approach," he said quietly, calculating trajectories faster than any cockpit computer could. "Adjust 2 degrees starboard, turbulence correction. Hold glide slope." Suddenly, a massive metallic object appeared on the descent path. A cargo drone, larger than any standard unmanned aircraft, careened unpredictably across the sky. Its twisted wings reflected the dim sunlight. Reynolds' stomach plummeted. "Hold your course," he shouted, gripping the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. Alex barked precise instructions, voice calm but urgent. "Bank left 15 degrees, flare at 200, don't overcorrect, maintain descent rate." The plane tilted violently, the passengers' screams rising to a crescendo. Laptops, trays, and luggage flew into the aisle. A toddler shrieked as his mother clutched him tight. The drone scraped the fuselage with a deafening metallic screech. Sparks erupted, and a small panel tore loose, careening across the cabin. Reynolds felt the plane lurch as the left wing flexed unnaturally. Lena's face was pale, sweat streaming down her temples. "We're losing structural integrity," she shouted. Alex's fingers tightened over the edge of the co-pilot seat. "We can compensate, adjust flaps, control spoilers, maintain glide slope. Trust me." Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second, a lifetime in an emergency like this, then followed the teen's precise instructions. The plane leveled slightly. The drone, as if mocking them, spun out of control and plummeted past the wing. Outside, Denver's sprawling lights flickered beneath them. The runway was visible, but they were not out of danger. A new threat emerged almost immediately. A private small plane, off course and unresponsive to tower commands, intersected their glide path. Reynolds' stomach knotted. Collision risk, catastrophic. Alex were going to hit it. Alex's voice was sharp, unwavering. "Bank 30 degrees left, flare, glide slope maintained, we'll miss it. Adjust descent rate by 20 knots. Reynolds followed, heart hammering, hands trembling. The plane tilted sharply, passengers screaming anew as trays and belongings tumbled. A coffee pot spilled, searing hot liquid spraying across seats. The two aircraft passed within mere hundreds of feet of each other. Reynolds exhaled shakily. That was too close," he muttered. Lena's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide in terror. Alex didn't relax. "We're not safe yet. Brace for turbulence. There's a thermal pocket ahead." He traced the air currents and turbulence with the precision of a seasoned pilot, despite having never flown an actual jet before. The plane shook violently, cabin lights flickering, oxygen masks dangling. Passengers screamed, some clutching each other in silent prayer. The plane shuddered again, this time violently enough to knock Reynolds' coffee cup onto the floor of the cockpit. Sparks popped from the console overhead. Alex's voice rang out over the chaos. Adjust flaps 10 degrees. Hold glide slope. Turbulence compensated. Reynolds followed the instructions, heart pounding as the plane leveled momentarily. Outside, the city lights of Denver were now close enough to see cars stopped on highways, headlights forming long streaks. Below, shadows of buildings and trees flickered past. The runway was almost in sight, but still too far. Suddenly the engines, long silent, gave a faint shudder, a dying groan as if mocking their efforts. Reynolds' eyes widened. Both engines were now completely dead, irrecoverable. "We have no thrust," he said through gritted teeth. Alex's jaw tightened. "We don't need it. Glide, control descent, prepare for emergency contact. Brakes won't deploy, we'll slide on the fuselage. Focus on maintaining flare and descent angle." Lena's face was pale, voice trembling. "You're seriously going to let a teenager tell us how to land a plane, on a runway with traffic and zero engines?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. "We don't have a choice. This is our only shot. Listen to him, follow instructions, live or die." The plane descended rapidly, buffeted by turbulence and debris from the earlier collision. Sparks erupted from the left wing, where the cargo drone had torn a gash. The fuselage groaned, as if protesting the impossibility of survival. Passengers screamed, some clutching their seats, others sobbing. Alex's eyes never wavered. He guided Reynolds' hands through every adjustment, whispering calculations for angle of attack, glide slope, airspeed, and flare timing. "Bank 2 degrees, glide slope stable, turbulence compensated, flare at 200 feet, he instructed. Suddenly, a scream cut through the cabin, high-pitched, terrified. A woman clutched her child as the plane jolted violently, the wing flexing under stress. Sparks shot from the console overhead. Reynolds gritted his teeth, holding the yoke as if his life depended on it, because it did. Alex leaned closer, voice precise, unwavering. "We're approaching the threshold. Adjust glide slope, flare now, keep level, maintain control." The plane shuddered violently, fuselage groaning, metal flexing, cabin rattling. Outside, the runway lights were clearer now, but the final 100 feet would decide everything. Reynolds' hands shook, sweat dripping down his temples. Lena clutched a console, white-knuckled. The entire cabin seemed suspended in an impossible limbo between life and death. Then another alarm sounded, warning of system failure, fire risk, hydraulic issues. Sparks erupted overhead. The plane pitched slightly to the left, throwing passengers against their restraints. One tray table hit the ceiling and fell back violently. Alex's eyes narrowed, scanning instruments and terrain simultaneously. Compensate with rudder, minor adjustment, flare maintained, glide controlled. His voice was calm, almost eerily confident, as if he had rehearsed this exact moment thousands of times. Reynolds followed Alex's instructions to the letter. The plane leveled. The runway was directly below now, lights gleaming, reflecting off the wet tarmac from a light drizzle. They were alive, but barely. And then, just as relief threatened to creep in, another blaring warning cut through the cockpit. The final approach sensors detected wind shear. Gusts were hitting at 25 knots, pushing the aircraft dangerously off course. Reynolds' heart skipped. Alex's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the tension. "Brace for sudden descent, maintain glide slope, flare on my mark now." Passengers screamed, holding onto anything solid. The plane lurched violently, rocking side to side. Sparks flew from the console. The runway was closer now, the light reflecting dangerously off wet tarmac, a cruel reminder of how small the margin for error truly was. Reynolds glanced at Alex. The teenager, face pale but eyes blazing, was ready. This was the moment of truth. All calculations, all practice, all fear boiled down to one final descent. In that split second, as the ground rushed ever closer and turbulence battered the fuselage, everyone realized the impossible was about to be attempted. The northern runway stretched like a lifeline below, bright strips of light cutting through the dim haze of early morning. But that lifeline felt impossibly far as the crippled plane shuddered violently with every gust of wind. Sparks flickered from overhead panels, sending tiny cascades of light across the cockpit. Reynolds' knuckles whitened on the yoke. Lena's hands were shaking, barely able to manipulate the secondary controls. Alex Harper sat in the co-pilot seat, pale and drenched in sweat, but his eyes burned with unrelenting focus. "We don't have much time," he said, voice firm. "Engines are dead. Landing gear is jammed. We're going to have to slide the fuselage along the runway. No throttle, no brakes. Total control with rudder, flaps, and spoilers. Can you do it?" Reynolds swallowed hard. The impossible plan made his stomach churn. A belly landing on a 737 without functioning landing gear was something no simulator could fully prepare a pilot for. Lives hung in the balance. But he nodded. "We'll do it, step by step. I'm trusting you, Alex. Every word counts." Alex's jaw tightened. "Then follow my instructions exactly. We adjust flaps gradually, control descent with a glide slope of 2 degrees, flare at 200 feet and slide along the fuselage. Focus on wind shear. There's a pocket up ahead." The plane lurched violently, tossing passengers in their seats. Screams echoed through the cabin, bobbies cried, and luggage tumbled down the aisles. Flight attendants shouted for calm, though their voices trembled with fear. Reynolds' eyes darted to the altimeter, 1,500 feet. The runway lights were growing sharper, closer, yet still terrifyingly distant. Alex's voice rang out calmly over the chaos. "Adjust left rudder slightly, 2 degrees, maintain descent. Brace for turbulence, don't overcorrect." Reynolds followed, muscles straining against the yoke as the fuselage tilted slightly. Sparks erupted overhead from damaged consoles. Outside, Denver's city lights shimmered below, streets and buildings flashing in the mist. The runway now glimmered directly ahead, but the final approach was fraught with peril. A gust of wind shifted the plane violently. Passengers screamed anew. Reynolds' heart hammered. "Steady, flare at 200 feet now," Alex commanded, voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Reynolds pulled back slightly on the yoke, attempting the delicate flare. The fuselage trembled as the nose lifted, a fraction of an inch, then another. Sparks flew from a panel overhead, rattling the cockpit. Lena gritted her teeth, fingers dancing over instruments to stabilize systems. The cabin groaned, metal flexing as the plane's belly edged closer to the tarmac. Alex leaned forward, eyes scanning every instrument, every visual cue. "Steady, glide slope perfect. Adjust rudder 2 degrees, spoilers ready. We're almost there." The plane dropped closer, 100 feet, 80, 50. Outside, the runway rushed toward them like a river of light. Sparks flared from the left wing where the drone collision had caused structural damage. Reynolds felt the plane flex beneath his hands. He glanced at Alex, who whispered, "Don't panic, control is in your hands." The first contact came with a deafening screech. The fuselage's belly scraped against the tarmac, sparks flying outward, tires unable to deploy. Passengers screamed, bracing against seats and each other. Reynolds fought to maintain a straight glide, muscles straining, heart hammering. Alex's voice was a calm anchor amid chaos. "Maintain flare, adjust rudder, slide along centerline smooth." The plane's nose bounced slightly as the fuselage made further contact, sparks spraying across the runway like fireworks. A wingtip scraped the asphalt, sending metal screeching. Passengers gripped each other, gasping, praying. A woman sobbed quietly, her child clinging to her like a lifeline. Reynolds' knuckles ached from holding the yoke. Lena's face was pale, sweat dripping as she adjusted rudder and spoiler controls, following Alex's precise instructions. Outside, the runway stretched endlessly, but the plane was slowing, sliding, holding together against impossible odds. Halfway along runway, maintain glide's smooth adjustments. Flare, Alex instructed, voice steady despite tremors of adrenaline running through his body. The aircraft continued its long, grating slide, sparks flying from belly panels. A sudden jolt shook the fuselage violently. One wing scraped against a small light pole at the runway's edge. The impact rocked the plane, throwing passengers forward, and a loud metallic groan echoed through the cabin. Reynolds' stomach churned as the plane veered slightly. "Correct rudder, adjust left, smooth, almost there," Alex commanded, every word precise, unwavering. The plane continued to grind along the runway, metal screaming against asphalt. Passengers screamed, clinging to each other, bracing for the unimaginable. Sparks shot from the left wing again, and smoke began to fill the cabin. Yet Alex's calm precision guided Reynolds' hands, turning panic into controlled action. Finally, with the skill of a miracle and the courage of a teen prodigy, the plane's forward motion began to slow. Friction between the fuselage and runway burned away speed, sparks and smoke marking every second. Passengers began to gasp in relief, though fear still held them tight. Alex exhaled, voice soft but steady. Maintain glide, we're almost stopped, rudder adjustment slow. The plane scraped its final meters along the tarmac, belly finally sliding to a halt. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of smoke and the groan of stressed metal. The cabin was shaken, battered, but alive. Reynolds exhaled shakily, letting go of the yoke for the first time in what felt like hours. Lena wiped sweat from her brow, trembling. We did it," she whispered, voice barely audible. Passengers slowly unclenched, some crying in disbelief. A woman hugged her child tightly, tears streaking her face. A man shook, muttering prayers under his breath. Reynolds glanced at Alex, who slumped slightly in the co-pilot seat, face pale, exhausted, yet eyes burning with unrelenting focus. You saved them," Reynolds said, voice breaking. "All of them, every single one." Alex shook his head, exhausted but relieved. "I just did what I practiced, what I had to, that's all." The emergency crews, alerted by the emergency landing, scrambled down the runway, hoses and lights blazing. Firefighters approached cautiously, ready for flames or catastrophe. But the plane was still intact, passengers slowly exiting via emergency slides, shaken but alive. Reynolds stepped back, chest heaving. He looked at Alex, who now finally allowed himself to slump fully, adrenaline giving way to exhaustion. "I can't believe we survived," Reynolds muttered, voice thick. Outside, the early morning sun began to rise, casting pale light over the runway. The smoke and sparks from the landing dissipated into the cold air, leaving a plane that defied odds, guided by an unlikely hero. Yet as emergency crews helped everyone from the cabin, Reynolds noticed something. A gash along the fuselage, deep, jagged, and ominous. Had it been slightly deeper, slightly off centerline, the story would have ended differently. Alex's voice broke the silence. "We got lucky, that's all it is, lucky." Reynolds shook his head, awed and speechless. It wasn't luck, it was skill, and courage, incredible courage. But even as relief swept the runway, a faint alarm continued to beep from the cockpit instruments, a reminder that survival, even when miraculous, carried scars. Sparks, scratches, damage, they were reminders of what nearly ended in tragedy. And somewhere in the early morning haze, Denver's lights glittered like distant stars, oblivious to the lives hanging by a thread, now saved by a 16-year-old who had faced the impossible. The roar of emergency vehicles filled the air as fire trucks and ambulances rushed down the runway, lights flashing in the early morning haze. The passengers, still trembling from the belly landing, were ushered off the plane by paramedics and flight attendants. Some clung to each other, weeping, others moved in stunned silence. Reynolds, Lena, and Alex remained in the cockpit, surveying the damage and trying to process what had just happened. Reynolds' hands trembled as he removed them from the yoke. Sweat dripped down his face, mingling with streaks of grime from the cockpit. "Alex, I don't even know how to begin to thank you," he muttered, voice thick with emotion. "You just saved over 200 lives." Alex slumped in the co-pilot seat, pale and exhausted. I just did what I had to do," he whispered, almost inaudibly. His fingers still tingled from gripping the seat, muscles sore from the stress of controlling a plane far beyond his experience. The passengers were being led to temporary triage tents set up by emergency crews on the tarmac. Some were checked for minor injuries, bruises, scrapes, shock, but all were alive. One man, who had been clutching his laptop throughout the descent, knelt on the runway, shaking, whispering, "I can't believe we made it. I can't believe it." A flight attendant approached Reynolds and Alex cautiously, eyes wide. "Captain, we need to evacuate the cockpit, sir. There's a risk of fire and the structural integrity of the plane is compromised." Reynolds nodded, glancing at Alex. "We'll follow you." As they climbed down the emergency slide, the sound of sirens and helicopters filled the air. Emergency crews swarmed around the plane, inspecting engines, wings, and fuselage. Sparks from damaged panels had mostly dissipated, but the gashes along the left wing and fuselage were alarming. One firefighter shook his head. "That plane should have broken apart. It shouldn't even be sitting here in one piece." Passengers watched from the tarmac, some weeping, some hugging strangers, some in stunned silence. Alex was guided to a nearby emergency tent, wrapped in a blanket, shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. A nurse checked his vitals, murmuring reassurances. "Heart rate's elevated," she said softly. "You're in shock, but otherwise you're fine." Alex nodded weakly, eyes scanning the faces of passengers nearby. Some were staring at him in awe, disbelief mingling with gratitude. Children, wide-eyed and still trembling, whispered to their parents, "He saved us." Reynolds approached him, voice low but intense. "Alex, people need to understand what you just did. You didn't just save your own life, you saved every single person on this plane. That's heroism on a scale I've never seen." Alex shook his head. I just kept thinking about the procedures. If I messed up, even a little, it could have been over." His voice trembled. "I just did what I had trained for, what I had to do." Meanwhile, authorities began taking statements from passengers. Questions swirled around the teen who had helped land a crippled aircraft. Witnesses described him with disbelief, some insisting it was impossible for someone his age to have the composure and knowledge to perform such a feat. One elderly man, tears streaming down his face, muttered, "I've flown for decades, never seen anything like it. He saved our lives, all of them. That boy, he's an angel." Despite the heroics, tension remained. The damage to the plane was severe. Structural engineers, emergency crews, and airline officials gathered near the runway. One inspector shook his head. If any of those calculations had been off, if the flare was late or the glide slope slightly misjudged, this could have ended in catastrophe. A news helicopter hovered above, capturing the scene. Cameras focused on Alex, bundled in a blanket, surrounded by emergency personnel. The story was already spreading through social media. A teenager mid-flight, assisting with the landing of a crippled 737. Tweets, videos, and posts began to circulate almost instantly, some expressing awe, some disbelief, some fear of the near miss. Yet for Alex, none of it mattered. He sat quietly, shivering slightly from adrenaline, listening to the distant murmur of survivors recounting their fear. His mind kept replaying the critical seconds, the flares, the glide, the jarring slide along the tarmac. Every miscalculation had been a heartbeat away from disaster. Reynolds crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You kept your head when everything else went crazy. You were unbelievable." Alex's eyes welled with tears. I was scared. I almost froze, but I remembered the procedures. I just kept thinking every life matters, and if I could help, even a little, I had to try. At that moment, one of the firefighters approached, holding a small tablet. "Captain, we've got a preliminary assessment of the fuselage damage. You're lucky. The wing flexed, panels scorched, but nothing critical failed. That kid's calculations saved this plane." Reynolds exhaled, a mixture of relief and lingering tension. Lucky? No, skill, courage, unbelievable courage. But even amid the relief, another tension lingered. Airport officials and airline executives had begun arriving, faces grim. Legal implications, investigations, and questions of safety protocol loomed. How had both engines failed simultaneously? How had a teenager ended up in the cockpit during an emergency? Reynolds noticed the scrutiny forming in the official's eyes, the mix of awe and concern. He placed a protective hand on Alex's shoulder. "Don't worry about them right now. You need to rest. You've done more than anyone could ask." Alex nodded, exhausted, head leaning against the tent wall, but a small part of him still couldn't process what had just happened. Hundreds of lives had depended on him, on his knowledge, instincts, and composure under pressure. And somehow, they had survived. Outside, the early morning sun began breaking through clouds, casting light on the tarmac, the damaged plane, and the swarm of emergency vehicles. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause in awe of what had just occurred. Yet in the midst of relief, a subtle tension remained. Officials were conferring quietly near the plane, pointing at panels, engines, and systems. Whispers of investigation, mechanical failure, and liability hung in the air. One airline executive muttered almost to himself, "How did both engines fail at the same time? And how did a 16-year-old land a plane? We need answers." Reynolds looked at Alex, voice low but urgent. "We may have survived the landing, but the questions aren't over. There will be scrutiny, tests, and the world watching. Are you ready for that?" Alex exhaled slowly, finally allowing the adrenaline to fade, yet eyes sharp despite exhaustion. I guess we don't have a choice. But right now, I just want to make sure everyone is okay." Reynolds nodded, placing a reassuring hand on the teen's shoulder. "And they are, thanks to you, but be prepared. This isn't over. People will want to know every second, every decision, every calculation you made, and some won't believe it." The survivors continued to move past the runway toward ambulances and waiting medical staff. Families reunited, cries of relief echoed, and the media began arriving in force, capturing the aftermath of what could only be described as a miracle. And in the midst of the chaos, Alex Harper, 16, the unlikely hero of Flight 427, finally allowed himself a deep, shuddering breath. He had saved lives, defied odds, and faced the impossible. Yet even as relief washed over him, he couldn't shake the shadow of the near miss. The thought that a single miscalculation, a fraction of a second, could have undone everything. And somewhere in the early morning sky above Denver, the wrecked plane sat as both a monument to survival and a reminder of how thin the line between disaster and miracle truly was. The early morning sun stretched its golden fingers across Denver International Airport, glinting off emergency vehicles, the damaged fuselage, and the swarm of media vans that had suddenly appeared. News helicopters circled overhead, their rotors chopping the sky, as reporters scrambled for vantage points. Social media was already ablaze with posts, videos, and live streams from passengers and bystanders. The story of Flight 427, a crippled plane landed by a 16-year-old, was spreading faster than wildfire. Alex Harper sat on a bench near the tarmac, wrapped in a blanket, exhaustion etched into his features. The adrenaline from the emergency landing had begun to fade, leaving a weight that seemed almost physical pressing down on him. Emergency personnel occasionally checked on him, measuring vitals and offering water, but no words of praise reached him yet. Then the first journalist approached, microphone in hand, eyes wide with disbelief. "Alex, can you tell us what happened? How did you land the plane?" Alex shook his head slowly, overwhelmed. I just followed the procedures. I did what I had to do." The reporter pressed closer. "But you're only 16. Hundreds of lives depended on you. People are calling you a hero." Alex's gaze fell to the ground, words caught in his throat. Hero. He had just survived something unimaginable and had guided a plane to a belly landing without gear. The thought that people were already elevating him into legend made his stomach tighten. Meanwhile, airline officials, federal investigators, and airport authorities crowded around the wrecked plane. Panel inspections, photographs, and mechanical assessments began almost immediately. "We need to determine how both engines failed simultaneously," one official muttered, voice low but urgent. "And how a civilian, let alone a teenager, was allowed access to the cockpit during an emergency." Reynolds hovered near Alex, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "Ignore them for now," he said quietly. "You need to rest. We'll handle the questioning." But rest wasn't coming. Within minutes, more journalists approached, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Helicopters whirred overhead, capturing footage of the teen sitting stoically on the bench, a lone figure against the chaos of emergency crews and flashing lights. Alex's phone buzzed incessantly. Messages poured in, congratulations, disbelief, even threats of legal questions. He couldn't catch a break. Every notification felt like a reminder that this was only the beginning. Reynolds turned to him, voice low and urgent. "Alex, the FAA, airline officials, and media, they're going to want to talk to you. They'll dissect every move you made, every decision. Are you ready for that?" Alex hesitated. He had trained for simulations, emergency landings, even theoretical scenarios, but nothing prepared him for the glare of the world, thousands of eyes judging, praising, and questioning him simultaneously. I think so," he muttered, unsure. Back on the tarmac, the FAA investigators began taking statements. Passengers were called forward one by one, asked to recount the landing, the panic, and the moment they realized Alex had taken command. Many described the teen with wide-eyed awe, a calming presence, precise, unshakable even in the face of unimaginable danger. One elderly woman, voice trembling, recounted, "I thought we were going to die, but then he stayed calm. He spoke to the captain. He saved us. That boy, he's a miracle." The investigators nodded, taking notes, but their eyes held a trace of skepticism. One remarked to a colleague, "We'll need to verify everything. A 16-year-old guiding a commercial jet, it doesn't compute. Procedures, manuals, simulators, yes. Real-life execution, we need the data." Meanwhile, social media exploded. Hashtags like Teen Pilot Hero and Flight 427 Miracle were trending globally. Clips of passengers crying in disbelief, flight attendants applauding, and Alex quietly instructing Reynolds in the cockpit went viral. Some commenters marveled, others questioned, some expressed outright skepticism. The airline CEO arrived, flanked by security and media. His face was grave but tinged with relief. "This could have been catastrophic," he said, voice echoing across the tarmac. "Thanks to the quick thinking and courage of those in the cockpit, especially this young man, we avoided a tragedy. We owe him everything." Alex shrank slightly as the words washed over him. Recognition was overwhelming, yet terrifying. The weight of responsibility, the knowledge that hundreds of lives had been literally in his hands, pressed down harder than he could have imagined. Reynolds stepped forward, voice steady. He didn't just think fast, he stayed calm. He guided us through an impossible emergency. Every procedure, every adjustment, calculated under stress most adults couldn't withstand. That teen saved lives today. But even as praise flowed, tension lingered. Investigators were still inspecting the engines, documenting every panel, every wire. Structural engineers measured flex points on the wings and fuselage. Lawyers whispered about liability and potential lawsuits. Questions loomed. How did both engines fail? How did the cockpit door open mid-flight? How had a teenager even known the emergency procedures? Alex felt the eyes of the world on him, a mix of awe, disbelief, and scrutiny. He had survived. He had saved lives. Yet he realized survival and heroism didn't shield him from questions, criticism, and attention. The spotlight was intense, invasive, and relentless. And then a subtle new tension appeared, whispers from the FAA team. "We need to examine why the procedures weren't followed automatically," one muttered. Why was manual guidance necessary? How did a civilian intervene in a cockpit emergency? Alex's stomach tightened. He had done what needed to be done, but now questions would follow him everywhere: school, home, media appearances, legal scrutiny. Would anyone see the humanity in the teen who had acted decisively, or only the breach of protocol? Reynolds crouched beside him again, voice quiet. "Alex, don't let them shake you. You did the right thing. Every calculation, every word, it saved lives. The rest, we'll navigate it together." But Alex, exhausted and overwhelmed, could only nod. Inside, the thrill of survival clashed with the weight of fame and inquiry. He had saved a plane full of people, but the world was already circling like vultures, hungry for explanations, recognition, or even blame. Outside, reporters shouted questions, cameras captured every moment, and helicopters circled. The runway hummed with activity: emergency crews, airline officials, investigators, and media. And Alex Harper, only 16, found himself at the epicenter of a story bigger than any simulation, any practice scenario, any ordinary life could prepare him for. And even as applause and praise mingled with questions and scrutiny, one fact remained undeniable. A teenager had guided a crippled commercial jet to safety, defying odds that seemed insurmountable. Yet the story wasn't over, not even close, because beyond the headlines, beyond the praise, lurked questions no one could yet answer, and a world that would demand every detail, every calculation, every moment of courage explained. The days after Flight 427's miraculous landing were a blur of media appearances, interviews, and official investigations. Alex Harper, once an ordinary teenager from suburban Denver, found himself at the center of a national, and soon international, spotlight. Every news outlet, every social media feed, every headline seemed to ask the same impossible question: how did a 16-year-old save over 200 lives in a disabled commercial jet? Despite the attention, Alex remained quiet, subdued, still processing the gravity of what had occurred. His parents hovered close, proud but concerned, wary of the sudden intrusion into their once ordinary lives. "Alex," his mother whispered one morning, "people are calling you a hero. Do you understand what that means?" Alex shook his head slowly. I just did what I had to do. I followed procedures. I stayed calm. I tried not to think about failing, because if I did, everyone would have been lost." His father, eyes brimming with unshed tears, clasped his son's shoulder. "You saved lives, Alex. That's more than anyone could ever ask for, more than I could imagine myself doing. You're a hero, whether you want it or not." Meanwhile, the FAA and airline officials released preliminary reports. Both engines had failed due to a rare mechanical malfunction, exacerbated by a mid-air collision with a rogue cargo drone. The cockpit's emergency protocols had been triggered, but the simultaneous system failures and wing damage made conventional recovery impossible. Analysts noted that without Alex's precise guidance, the plane's glide and eventual belly landing could have easily ended in catastrophe. News outlets aired footage of Alex instructing Captain Reynolds during the descent. Each frame highlighted the teen's calm, focused demeanor amid chaos. Analysts dissected the landing in slow motion, marveling at the near-perfect glide slope, flare timing, and rudder adjustments. The nation collectively held its breath as experts called the landing an unprecedented feat of human courage and technical skill. The passengers, too, continued to recount their experiences. At press conferences, many broke into tears while describing how Alex's calm voice had steadied both crew and passengers. Flight attendants who had witnessed the landing firsthand repeatedly emphasized his composure. "I've trained for decades," one said, voice quivering, "and I've never seen anyone, adult or child, handle an emergency like that." Despite praise, scrutiny lingered. Investigators asked questions about how Alex gained access to the cockpit, why the co-pilot had deferred control, and the unusual circumstances that allowed a teenager to intervene. The airline faced criticism for protocol breaches, and Reynolds' decision to follow Alex's instructions became a topic of debate among aviation experts. Alex's school was abuzz with attention. Classmates and teachers alike treated him as a living legend, a symbol of courage beyond his years. Friends whispered in hallways, half in awe, half in disbelief. "Did you see the video?" one asked. "He's literally the only reason everyone's alive." Yet for Alex, fame was overwhelming. He struggled to reconcile the exhilaration of having saved lives with the pressure of constant attention. Every phone notification, every headline, felt like a reminder that the world expected perfection, analysis, and explanation. And deep down, he was haunted by the thought that a single misstep could have led to tragedy. One afternoon, Reynolds visited Alex at his home, carrying a small leather-bound journal. "I want you to have this," Reynolds said, handing it over. "It's mine from years of flying. Notes on emergencies, glide paths, and everything in between. You're the only person I trust to fill it with the truth of what happened." Alex opened it carefully, pages filled with precise calculations and handwritten notes from Reynolds' years in the cockpit. He looked up, eyes wide. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep learning," Reynolds replied. "Because courage alone isn't enough. You've got the skill, the mind, and now the experience. Remember, heroism isn't about glory. It's about action when everything seems impossible." A few weeks later, the airline hosted a private ceremony. Survivors, crew, and emergency personnel gathered to honor Alex. Families approached him, some tearful, some hesitant, each offering gratitude. "You saved my daughter," one mother whispered, clutching her child. "I can never thank you enough." Alex, still quiet, simply nodded, accepting their thanks but unable to speak fully. The weight of the experience lingered. The world had called him a hero, but he knew survival had been a fragile balance of skill, timing, and luck. Then came national recognition. The president extended an official commendation for bravery under extraordinary circumstances. Awards, media features, and invitations to speak to aviation and safety organizations followed. For a teenager who had once spent weekends playing flight simulators, his life had transformed entirely. Yet amid accolades, Alex sought solitude. He visited the wrecked plane one final time, now safely secured and marked with inspection tags. He ran a hand along the dented fuselage, sparks of memory igniting in his mind, the cockpit shaking, passengers screaming, Reynolds' voice Lena's guidance. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "We survived," he whispered, voice trembling. "We really survived." Reynolds appeared beside him, eyes scanning the scars of the plane. "And you made it happen," he said softly. "You saved them all." Alex exhaled slowly. "I couldn't have done it alone, but I learned that in moments like that, fear has to exist, but you can't let it control you. You have to act. Even if you're terrified, even if it seems impossible, you have to act." As the sun set over Denver, casting golden light across the tarmac, the plane glinted in reflection, a testament to survival, courage, and human ingenuity. Alex Harper, 16, had faced the impossible and prevailed. Not because he wanted fame, recognition, or accolades, but because, in a moment where countless lives depended on precise action and unwavering focus, he had chosen to step forward. And in that choice, he had redefined what it meant to be a hero. In the quiet aftermath, as the world marveled and questioned, Alex understood one fundamental truth. Heroism wasn't about the headlines, the awards, or the cameras. It was about courage under pressure, skill under fire, and humanity in the face of disaster. And with that understanding, he finally allowed himself to smile. The end.